Today we're joined by Andrew Hemming, Managing Director of Centuria Healthcare. Centuria Healthcare is a highly specialised fund that provides unlisted healthcare property investment options to individual, wholesale and institutional investors. At the time of this recording, the Centuria Healthcare portfolio encompasses more than 70 assets across medical centres, specialist centres, short-stay hospitals, specialist disability accommodation, mental health facilities, life sciences, labs and aged care facilities, totalling $1.4 billion in assets under management. The healthcare real estate specialists manage 3 development funds, a wholesale fund, 5 closed unlisted funds, a new joint venture with Morgan Stanley Real Estate Investing, and an open-ended unlisted fund that has 23 properties within its portfolio worth circa $627 million. Andrew in particular has more than 2 decades experience across investment markets in Australia, the US and Europe, including fixed term interest markets, equity derivatives, and of course commercial real estate. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us and for the time. We'll jump straight into the first question. Nationwide, we've continuously seen the rising popularity of healthcare investments. It's been really well documented over the past few years. Having been the Managing Director of the Centuria Healthcare Fund for 10 years now, how have you seen the market evolve, and from both a returns perspective and an operational or development perspective?
Thanks for having me, Marcello. So over the last 10 or 11 years, we've seen the rise in popularity of healthcare real estate. We've seen cap rates compress from, say, 9% down to 4%. In some cases in Sydney, even sub 4%, 3.5%. And I think that really is illustrative of institutional investors wanting to gain exposure into the space. And I think it's really been driven by long-term leases, net leases, really strong corporate organisations, but also pent-up demand, particularly after a pandemic. So we've seen the securitisation of healthcare real estate go from, when I first started, around $5 billion to probably around about $15-16 billion today.
In terms of Centuria's current portfolio, what does that look like from a tenant profile perspective, and where are you seeing the greatest opportunities now in the healthcare space, obviously given that rising popularity and more money coming into the sector? Is it further development? Is it acquiring existing complete investment products?
So across our 70 or so properties, we've got national tenants, and we've got probably around about 180 tenants. They're all very financially well backed, either by private equity or large institutions. And they range across the health chain, so from medical centres all the way up to short stay inpatient private hospitals, as well as some components of aged care. Traditionally, we've been buying existing buildings on a sale and leaseback or just from private vendors, generally off market, which I'm sure will change over the next few years. But we have, over the last 2 or 3 years, gone upstream and started looking at development a lot more. And that's really because our tenants are wanting to relocate and create new models of care. So it's a lot harder, particularly in this environment, but we think it bodes well for our investors.
Now, the business has pretty consistently been in the news. You're probably in the news more than any other healthcare fund over the past couple of years for a lot of your recent partnerships, specifically with doctors or health insurance funds. Probably more recently and most notably the commitment you received from Morgan Stanley, the $190 million commitment that was. Can you explain how the partnership came about and why it's come about? What's attracted a group like Morgan Stanley to invest in Centuria Healthcare?
Yeah, as I've just explained, there is going to be growing institutional investment. And so whilst our individual high net worth retail investors have served us well and will continue to serve us well, so long as we produce good returns, institutional investors are looking not just to gain exposure, but will help us with the riskier type of investment. So greenfield developments, large precincts, which we are continuing in regional locations, whether it be northern New South Wales or parts of Victoria. It's a business obviously that has a vast array of capital.
Now, in terms of assessing healthcare investments, what are some of the key factors yourself and the team would review when looking into the viability of an investment option, be it tenant profile, location, improvements, things of that nature?
I think there's two factors. There's the classic property factors that most property investors in commercial property would look at, and that's lease tenure, the type of covenant, the age of the asset, depreciation, the fit out, things like that. Then you've got probably healthcare strategic considerations, and so they are, the alignment. So if it's a hospital, you want those doctors either owning that business, that tenant in that hospital, as well as some of the bricks and mortar, either through a consulting suite or through an investment trust. And you want to make sure that that business is located in that market for the right tenant demand. So whether it be patients or residents, generally that comes with the level of affordability, but it also obviously comes with age and non-age related illnesses.
The challenges of private health and rising private health insurance costs have been pretty well documented over the past couple of years, particularly those increased out-of-pocket costs that have been arising. How can health investment groups like yourself, like Centuria Healthcare, partner with insurance providers to maximise patient outcomes into the future? And there's obviously a partnership you formed, I think, in 2021 with Medibank and one of the hospitals you're developing in Kew in Victoria here. Is that an example of a partnership that could assist in that future?
Look, it's a great example, but it's one example of what our strategy was way back when, which was trying through real estate to build more efficient healthcare. So very simply, healthcare premiums, as you just touched on, were rising at around 7%, wages growing at 2%. So what individuals were doing, they were opting out of the system and going into the public system, which is fine. Public system in Australia is very good, but then that just adds to the queue, which adds to time. Therefore, the wait lists continue to grow, and people who want to have, hip surgery, for example, were waiting up to 2 years. So what we're trying to do, not just with Medibank, but other corporate owners of hospitals and healthcare real estate, is to think about alignment, to think about how these businesses make money, so as those savings are passed through the true customer, which is the patient. And
you might have just touched on this to a point, but how have you seen the public or the government's funding of healthcare evolve in recent years? And is it a lack of funding, or is it the demand is so strong that has seen this kind of rise and increase in supply for the private sector?
It's not just a deep pool of capital to be provided in healthcare. What we're seeing in certain state budgets like Western Australia and Queensland is the proportion of health expenditure as state GDP is rising to unsustainable rates, 30+%, for example. So it's good to spend money, and I think the money from public and private will continue to grow, but they'll look at efficiency. And so what we've seen in the recent pandemic is public system work with the private system. Now, that's not necessarily a public-private partnership, but again, as those queues continue to grow for patients in the public system, the public healthcare system will rely on the private healthcare system for things like extra beds or even surgical theatres. So there'll be more money, but it'll be spent more efficiently.
Healthcare is still very much considered by many or labelled by many as an alternative investment class, but given the size of the Centuria healthcare portfolio and a substantial volume or influx of capital into that sector that you've touched on previously, do you think it's time that healthcare probably stop being labelled an alternative and more so be sitting as a core asset class amongst a number of others, particularly given the returns you've mentioned as well over the past 10 years?
Yeah, Marcello, I think that's absolutely right. And that's why institutional investors are now attracted to it, not just because of the returns, but they can see a long runway in healthcare. I think I've been in the paper saying that there's $100 billion of opportunity out there. There's other colleagues and other fund managers in healthcare real estate saying it's double that number. Look, I think simply this is a theme that's not going away. And, there's one undeniable fact is that we are all getting older. So our demand will increase in terms of healthcare needs.
And you've pretty much touched on it a few times across the interview, but to conclude and to summarise the benefits for those that might be, first-time privates or looking to invest in the Centuria Healthcare Fund as well, how would you summarise the benefits of healthcare investment? Is it the population you've touched on? Is it increased life expectancy? Is it a whole host of other factors as well?
Well, I think it's very tangible, and I think that when you put a business case forward to investors, they'll look at the returns, and the returns, as I've just touched on, are strong and stable. That's backed by long-term leases, net leases. There's 75% of our portfolio is CPI hedged, so inflation's a hot topic. It's always on the front story of the newspaper. So our investments are protected by inflation, but also it's tangible because people are more and more using healthcare, whether it be through the GP or whether it be through private hospitals. So for us, it's about a steady state. There'll be wild fluctuations around investment markets.
Perfect. Well, Andrew, thanks very much again for the time. Some highly valuable insights I'm sure a lot of people will gain a lot from. And if anyone has any questions, I think it's quite easy to search the Centuria Healthcare Fund in particular and look into that further for their own potential investments.
Thanks, Marcello. Thanks for having me.